Apologetics. I think you guys were all here, I think last week, when we were talking about, what is apologetics. And it's basically the word comes from the Greek word apologia, which means a verbal defense. And it's a defense of why we believe what we believe. And this study is going down answering three questions. The first question was, which we went over last week, was, does God exist? And we come to the conclusion that if God doesn't exist, then the only thing that would make sense would be atheism or a non-God religion. If he does exist, then the next question is for tonight, is the Bible true? And and so that's what we'll be looking at tonight, is the question of, is the Bible true? And we'll be looking at a couple of different ways of seeing if the Bible's true. And one of them is the text of the Bible. So we'll go over a little bit of the history of how we got our Bible and what makes it up. And then we'll look for the evidence of the Bible. And so the first thing that we'll look at, though, is how it originates. And let me first say this. If you were to have a person tell you something that you need to believe, would it be better to have somebody who was an eyewitness or somebody who just had hearsay? What would be better? Eyewitness, okay? Would it be better to have an eyewitness with a large gap between the time that it happened, or an eyewitness that happened near the time that it happened? Near the time. So even though we might love the fact that a guy who went through World War II is 90 years old now and doing his memoir, it would have been better to write it back right after he got back from the war, right? We can kind of follow that. So what we're going to be doing tonight is we're going to look at the Bible and saying, okay, do we have just hearsay stuff or do we have eyewitness stuff? Is the eyewitness from a long time back, or is the eyewitness from this is current, right? And that's kind of where we would come to the Bible and say, you know what, this is why I believe the Bible is true, because it was this and this, okay? All right. So the first thing is, go ahead and give me the next slide there. And this is what makes up the Bible. If you look at the Old Testament, is it working? Okay. The Old Testament has 39 books. And if you look at what's comprising in those books, is you have a history, which one do you think that is? Can you even read it? Genesis, right? Then we have the next books of the law, okay? And when you take the first book and the law together, you have 5 books. Do you know what that's called? The Pentateuch, right? It's a 5 penta, all right? So we call that the Pentateuch. So those are the first 5 books. Then we have some more history books. We have the wisdom or poetry. We have major prophets, and then we have minor prophets. So we have 66 books, total of 1,189 chapters, 31,102 verses. And this one comprises of 40 authors over 15 different centuries. Then if we look at the New Testament, we have the 4 Gospels, and then we have church history, which is what? Acts, all right? Then we have Paul's epistles, Pauline epistles, so the letters from Paul. Then we have general epistles, and then we have the final prophecy, which is which one? Revelation, right? Okay. So for both the Old and the New Testament, the crucial question is, not having any original copies or scraps of the Bible, can we reconstruct them well enough from the oldest manuscript evidence we do have, so as to give us a true, undistorted view of actual people, places, and events? The first person that we're going to talk about is the person that was called the scribe. And the scribe was considered a professional person in antiquity. So in history's past, a scribe was a very professional person. No printing presses existed, obviously, yet. So people were trained to copy documents. And this was usually undertaken by a very devout Jew. And the scribe believed that they were dealing with the actual word of God. And so therefore, they were extremely careful when they were doing their copying. So they didn't do this hastily. The earliest complete copy of a Hebrew Old Testament dates back to from 900 AD. In fact, they trained for years and years, working their way up through apprentice levels. Their work was meticulously checked and rechecked for error. If even the slightest error or imperfection was found, their work was destroyed. During the early part of the 10th century, this is around 916 AD, there was a group of Jews called the Masoretes. These Jews were meticulous in their copying. And how they would do it is when they were copying it, they didn't have punctuation, they didn't have paragraph lines. It was all in like a box. And so when they would get done, they would even count up how many letters were in each thing, in each of the writings. They would look at center letters. And if there was any deviation from any of those copying, then they would throw it out because they believed that, they were writing God's word and it had to be perfect. Comparisons of the Masoretic text with early Latin and Greek versions have also revealed careful copying and little deviation during the 1,000 years from 100 BC to 900 AD. But until this century, there was very little material written in Hebrew from antiquity that could be compared with the Masoretic text of the 10th century. So in other words, we have the Masoretic text, the Hebrew, we have the other copies made in Hebrew and made in Greek. And when they compare them, they still see that there was a very dedicated copying process done by all, and there's very little deviation. And we have proof of that because in 1947, there was a young boy or young boys maybe that were Bedouin goat herders, and they went and they found some strange clay jars on the cliffs near the Dead Sea. And do you know what they found? The Dead Sea Scrolls, okay? And what do you know of the Dead Sea Scrolls, any of you? What?
They were dead.
They were dead. The Dead Sea? Yeah. They were old. Okay. So if you remember in Bible history, the Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. And they believed that this sect of devout Jewish followers, and they were called the Essenes, right? And what they believed was that they took their leather scrolls and they took their parchments and different things and they put them into clay jars and they hid them from the Romans as they were invading the land. And so if you think about that, that was right around the time of Jesus that these scrolls went into the caves. And then we find them. And so all this time we've been saying, hey, we think that the Bible we have right now is pretty close to what was copied back then because of the meticulousness of the scribes. Well, then they have the Dead Sea Scrolls that date back to the time of Jesus, and they look at it and they say, oh yeah, this is like right on. And so as a matter of fact, one of the things that they found was they found the entire book of the copy of Isaiah. And let me read this to you. A complete document of Isaiah created quite a sensation since it was the first major biblical manuscript of great antiquity ever to be recovered. And it was more than 1,000 years of the oldest Hebrew text preserved by the Masoret tradition. The supreme value that these documents was in the ability of Bible scholars to compare them to those texts of the 10th century AD. Upon examination, there was little or no textual changes to those Masoretic texts where comparisons were possible. An assumption could then be made that the Masoretic scribes had probably been just as faithful in their copying of the other Bible text, which could now be compared to the Qumran material from the Essenes. So what did we learn? We learned that in Isaiah, there were only 17 letters that differed from the Masoretic text. So 17 letters out of the entire book of Isaiah. 10 of these were mere differences in spelling. Like, for example, how we say honor, Honor, and how the British say honor with the U in it, right? So those 11 of them were just kind of like that. And it really changed nothing in the meaning. 4 were very minor differences, such as the presence of a conjunction. And so basically like an and was put into it. And that was more just a style, and it wasn't anything substantive. The other 3 letters of the Hebrew are the Hebrew root for light. And this word was added to the text by someone after they said, "They shall see." And so they added the word light. And so those were really the only differences that they could find in that entire thing. And so you see the copy of Isaiah, they had partial copies of those first 5 books, the Pentateuch, Samuel 1 and 2, Habakkuk, and they're all dated around 100 BC. Pretty interesting, huh? All right. So that was the Masoret text. The next one we look at is called the Septuagint. And if you studied Latin or Italian, the word sept is the word for 7, right? And so the Septuagint was what they considered the copies of, at the time, 70 scholars. So the 70, now they believe 72, but that's how it got its name. The Greek translation of the Old Testament is called the Septuagint, and it's the Roman letters LXX, which is the number 70. Okay, so that's how they gave it that name. And these came primarily out of the scholars in Alexandria, Egypt, around 200 BC. And these were literal translations from the Hebrew. And these are also very good copies of the original translation. So let's look at who wrote the Old Testament. If you look in the strictest sense, the writings of the Old Testament are anonymous. There's only a few books that make explicit claims to the identity of their authors. Only by tradition do most books have an assigned author. Take the Pentateuch, for example. Only according to tradition is Moses supposed to have written these books during the 40 years in the desert, partly recording instruction from God and partly recording the history of the Jewish people. But if you think about it, there's obviously some problems with saying that Moses is the sole writer of those. For one, it records his death. Another is that how would he know the Canaanites were in the land yet, right? And so some of these things would have to have been put in later, right? And so that's why we really don't know definitively who really the authors were with all of them. Okay, so if you see here, Moses, 1500 BC, we would have a few of those problems that he wouldn't have known about yet if he had written them himself. Some theories are that they were put in there around the 10th to the 5th century BC, but a lot of things do point to Moses, and some of it is the historical evidence. For example, the price of a slave that was right on for around the time that Joseph was sold as a slave. And so it does point good to the point that it would have been around that same time as Moses. The abundance of details, the strong, dominant Jewish traditions, and obviously Moses is the main character of those books. Any questions so far? Okay. The next one is the Hebrew canon of the Old Testament. So as it is today, the Hebrew Bible at the turn of the era was a diverse assortment of sacred Jewish literature, law, and history literature, liturgy and poetry, proverb and prophecy, composed by different hands and in different places over hundreds of years. It existed then, as it had for centuries, as a collection of loose parchment or papyrus scrolls, each normally containing no more than one book of the Bible. By modern times, there was no surviving manuscripts from the hand of an original author. Each scroll had been painstakingly copied from an earlier copy over and over, again, generation after generation. And then, as we talked about the scribes, these were done meticulously also. The scrolls were probably kept together as a collection in boxes and other containers, or at the Jewish synagogue or library, or at the house church where Christians worshiped. While they may have been arranged in order, any significance that was attached to the sequence of the books was not fully reflected physically until centuries later. So, if we look at the canon of the Old Testament, this is how we ended up with it. We have the Hebrew canon, which was really the Protestant Old Testament. We have the Septuagint, like I said, with the 70. This is what we now would consider the Roman Catholic Old Testament. And in this tradition, there were some books added, like Tobit, Judith, Maccabees, parts of Esther and Daniel are added to theirs. And it was only because of the difference in the Septuagint having those added things. But around 135 AD, they were closed, basically. The consensus was that the Bible was now completed as we see it now. And so early church leaders came to the conclusion of, okay, this is it. And, the eyewitness time of Jesus was now over. And we have what the apostles put out. And then they closed it. And only because of the location of the scholars in Alexandria do you have those differences. Obviously, the Greek-speaking Jews had at their disposal a Greek translation. They wanted to read theirs, and so it was easier for them to see the Septuagint part for their book. The Hebrew canon would not become formally fixed in Judaism until sometime after the Jewish war with Rome, which ended with the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple in 70 AD. The followers of Moses, of course, had been long accepted as inspired and authoritative, as had the former and latter prophets. The precise content of the writings, however, is still a matter of dispute until around the 135 AD. Later, when Christianity arose, Greek-speaking Christians naturally preferred the scriptures written in their own tongue, and the Septuagint became the version followed by the early church. When the writers of the New Testament quoted the Old Testament, it was usually the Septuagint that they quoted. But as the years passed and the church continued to grow, disagreement arose over which of the additional books of the Septuagint should be included in the Old Testament canon. These disagreements would go largely unresolved, and they account for the differences that exist today between the Bibles of the Protestant and the Roman Catholics. So that was the Old Testament. Now, the New Testament, we have the Greek manuscript evidence, and these are more than 4,000 different ancient Greek manuscripts containing all the portions of the New Testament that have survived until our time, and these are written on different materials. During the early Christian era, the writing materials most commonly used was papyrus. It's a highly durable reed that was from the Nile Valley, glued together to make kind of like a plywood and then allowed to dry in the sun. In the 20th century, many remains of documents, both biblical and non-biblical, have been discovered on papyrus, especially in the dry, arid land of North Africa and the Middle East. Another material used was a parchment, and this was made of the skin or sheep skin of sheep or goats, and was in wide use until the late Middle Ages, when paper began to replace it. It was scarce and more expensive, hence it was used almost exclusively for important documents. So we also have, so we have the manuscripts. We also have letters that the church leaders at that time wrote to each other about the scriptures. And so this is one of the greatest attestations of the authority of the New Testament are the masses of quotations taken from the pages of the early church leaders. This one guy named Dean Burgeon, in his research, he found 86,489 quotes in all of the early church fathers. And in fact, there are over 32,000 quotations from the New Testament found in writings from before the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. This other guy took those letters and early church writers, and he basically put it and reconstructed them. And what he found was basically all of the New Testament was in these quotes, with the exception of only 11 verses. So think about that. We have these manuscripts that were written, and we know that they were copied meticulously, but also we have letters from the early church leaders who were quoting those same scriptures. And if you add all those up together, you find that there was only like 11 verses of the whole New Testament missing from those letters that you can pull back together. And so, as you can see, the earliest fragments of the Gospel of John date back to 130 AD. Do you know when what most scholars believe around the time that Jesus died? Do you know what day that is? So a lot of them believe that he died around 30 AD, right? Which would have made him born roughly 3 or 4 BC, right? The second most common belief isn't like, you would think, oh, if it's not 30, then maybe it's 31, 32. Well, actually, the second most common belief is 33, is the time of his death. And the only reason why there's those two is because of the date when Passover happens. It just happens that it matches up to, the timing of the events of Jesus' death at Passover. And so that's why 30 is the number one, 33 is the second most popular belief. And so if you think about that, you think about, okay, you have the death of Jesus around 30 AD, right? And we're talking about 100 years later, right? And we still have a fragment from that. And so think about 100 years from right now. How much history do you think you could do just on your own? Think about 1923 and that time frame, and just on your own, without having extensive scholarly knowledge, how much you could come up with even on your own self around for what's happened back in the 1920s in our own brain, right? And so you could see, if there was really a problem with the scriptures, people that are living in that time would definitely be raising their hands saying, I have a problem with this, right? And when you think about some of the things that people say, okay, well, there's a problem with this gospel or this one, and there's a little difference in the story, okay? Well, that would be kind of the equivalent of saying, I have a real problem with the Revolutionary War because George Washington really didn't cut down the cherry tree, and he did lie. He never always told the truth, right? And so if you had some kind of an argument like that, you're like, well, that doesn't really take away from the Revolutionary War and the reason why it was fought and all those things that really the importance of it, even though some things might be a little bit off. Okay. All right. And then we look at all those 86,000 quotations from different church leaders at that time, and we can almost reconstruct the entire Bible with that. So if you look at other texts that are in antiquity, the way that they would evaluate one is to say, okay, well, how many copies do we have? And do they match up? Okay. And so if we were to look at, like, say, the Josephus, he was a famous historian. He wrote the book of Antiquities, all right? He lived from about 37 to 100 AD, right? The date of events that he was writing about was from 200 BC to 65 AD. So they believe he wrote it around 95. And the earliest manuscript or copy that we have is from 1050, year 1050, right? So that's the lapse from the event to the writing was either 10 to 300 years old, okay? And the lapse from the event to the manuscript, in his case, is 1,000 to 1,300 years, right? And so if you look at a popular book that everybody kind of agrees and says, oh, that's a good historical book of the Jewish people during that time, but yet it's 1,000 years at least between the time of the event and the earliest manuscript. And we're talking only 130 years, right? And so even other books that are out there don't have the evidence as much as we have on our Bible and the manuscripts that are out there. So the conclusion of that is the Bible, the interval then between the dates of original composition and the earliest extant evidence becomes so small as to be, in fact, negligible. And the last foundation for any doubt that the scriptures have come down to us subsequently as they were written has now been removed. Both the authenticity and the general integrity of the books of the New Testament may be regarded as finally established. Okay, so now let's look at the authorship of the New Testament. So in contrast to the Old Testament, many of the writings of the New Testament make strong and unambiguous claims as to the identity of their authors. By the early 2nd century AD, the question of apostolic origins were widely accepted in the early church. So because of we'll discuss the first 4 Gospels. So you have, like we said, Jesus was born sometime around 0 on our calendar, crucifixion around 30. You see Peter and Paul executed right after 60-something AD, destruction of Jerusalem in 70. And you can see where the eyewitness period is. And you can see the first Gospels being written during that time period. And so if we did have something that was not right, the eyewitnesses would obviously be alive at the time to say, hey, I saw it differently. It's not that way. The first 3 Gospels must have been written before 70 AD. So the Gospels, according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, books that are regarded by many as the most sacred of Christian writings, proclaim through dramatic narrative, recorded sayings, and theological proclamation the story of Jesus of Nazareth and the significance of his life, death, and resurrections. Through most of Christian history, the Gospels are regarded as the only authoritative record of Jesus' words and deeds. These are the recollection of either disciples who sat at Jesus' feet in the case of Matthew and John, or to close associates to the apostles in the case of Mark and Luke. Despite early and relative strong traditions supporting these apostolic connections, most biblical scholars today, from liberal skeptics to conservative traditionalists, agree that there's little direct evidence to state with certainty that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the Gospels that bear their names. Nowhere within the text do the writers identify themselves or claim unambiguously to have written the events that they described. The overwhelming consensus among biblical scholars today is that the Gospels must be judged formally, at least as anonymous. It's generally agreed as well that all the 4 books were composed from a variety of oral and written years following Jesus' crucifixion. Once the Gospels are, experts believe They were edited as they were copied and circulated among church elders during the late first and early second centuries. At best, these scholars say the Gospels are correctly linked to the names of these early church evangelists who originated the oral traditions. At worst, the Christ disciples were attached to the text later to their authority. But the problem with that is that if they were going to attach the name of an apostle to the book, then they kind of chose kind of the wrong ones, really. I mean, Matthew wasn't highly esteemed by a lot of Jews because he had been a tax collector, so that's not a really good person to pick if they had to pick someone to attach the name to it. Also, you might have gotten a little bit better for naming something from Peter or one of those other apostles that had maybe a little bit more esteem to the early church. And these different earlier church leaders referred to Gospels of Matthew and Luke as memoirs of the apostles. Writing even earlier, between 100 and 130, this bishop described Mark as the apostle that was Peter's interpreter, who wrote down accurately all that Peter remembered, things or doings of the Lord. He also mentioned that the apostle Matthew is having composed the sayings of the Lord. So is in the early church, right off the bat, these names were attached to these writings. So there's pretty good evidence that we can say that those were the names, those were the ones that were the writers or attached to those gospels, even though they never claimed to say it. So the formation of Christian scriptures was a slow and gradual process. In the early years of the church, the message of Christianity was transmitted orally. Preachers and evangelists, many of whom had witnessed the events of Jesus' life and had heard of his teachings, shared their vivid memories and proclaimed the message of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus the Messiah. As the years rolled on, however, and the church spread into Asia Minor and Rome, written records of the sayings of Jesus and the teachings of the apostles became increasingly important against the fading of memory and the death of the apostles. Eventually, these writings would assume a status equivalent to the Hebrew scriptures. There's little doubt that the earliest text of the to-be New Testament were the letters by Paul written around 50 AD. Soon the Gospels and the memoirs of the apostles joined the list. These texts conformed to the rule of faith, the Christian truth recognized in the early church. The first step into the official list was in 140 AD, and it was known as the Maccabean Canon. And this included 10 of Paul's letters and the Gospel of Luke. This list was soon pronounced heretic by the early church leaders, but sparked the need and the discussion for an official canon. And so if you go to that, you can see what they accepted at that time was the Gospels, Luke and Acts, the letters, 1 Peter, 1 John, and then that was by most of those were done by 110 AD. Questioned books were Hebrews, James, 2 Peter, 2 and 3 John, Jude, and Revelation. But they had a broad acceptance by 200 AD. And then ones that basically didn't get put in were ones that are listed up there. And some of those are not necessarily bad when you read them, but they are just, some of them are just, they decided that it was the same as the other ones. It was already covered. There might have been some, I'm trying to remember, one of them was, there was you know how the scriptures say that if you believe in Jesus, you're saved? Well, one of them might have said, if you understand these writings or understand what Jesus is saying, then you're saved. well, that was kind of like, well, that's not really what we're, it doesn't follow with kind of how we're teaching what we really believe that Jesus was trying to say. And so they threw out a lot of the things that were also in there. Now, there is one kind of a curious thing that was out there when these guys were writing their like the Gospels. Some of them were writing in a way where you could tell that they were using another source. And so maybe the Gospel of Mark was written first. And so as the next gospel was written, they might have had Mark's gospel, and they might have said, okay, I remember that story too. And so they were writing it. But then there was another, as they can tell that there was another source of something they were all pulling from. And it's a lost thing now, but they call it the Q. And the Q was, they believe, a writing that had a lot of the sayings that were in the Gospels now. The word comes from quell, which is a German word, and it just basically means hidden, right? And so there's that out there too. But the point is that as these were being formed and made into the Bible that we call the Bible now, we have plenty of evidence that it went back far enough to the eyewitnesses. And the eyewitnesses would have been able to say, hey, that's not how I remember it. And so we can be pretty sure that what we have today in our Bible is true. All right, go to the next one. So if you remember, we talked about how all of these different leaders had written about the scriptures. And so if you look at the list here of like Clement, who like 95 AD, Ignatius 110 AD, Polycarp, okay, these are all church leaders, bishops at the time. And they all have in their letters quote these different scriptures. And as we said earlier, they list the entire New Testament in their letters with the exception of like 11 verses. So we have plenty of evidence that what we have today is what we should have. That's true. All right, next one. So some people say, oh, these are the lost books of the New Testament. So if you ever hear anybody come up to you and say, yeah, what about these lost books? Well, they were really never, ever lost, right? They were just discarded because of certain reasons. And these are some of the ones that the infancy books, if you ever want some almost comedy, it's kind of a silly writings, really. Have anybody ever read any of them? No, I mean, I think it was written probably in the Middle Ages around that time, and it was at a time when people just were starving to know more about Jesus when he was a kid, right? Because if you look at the Gospels, how much do we really know about Jesus? We know the nativity story, then it skips until he's like 12, right? And then there's one little thing about him, and then next thing you know, he's ready to go into his ministry at 30, right? And so people were like, I think, starving to know, well, what did Jesus do? He had to have done some crazy things. And so in these books, you'll hear things like when he was a kid, a little baby, toddler, he's taking clay from a mud puddle and making birds, and it just is that kind of stuff. And I think it was just a need that people wanted to have, and they saw it as, no, that's not true. The Gospel of Nicodemus, it was one of those ones, again, that was kind of just a duplication of what was already in other ones. And then I kind of talked about the one that had, what is going to make you saved? Is it the sayings, or is it believing, in Jesus and being the Son? And then the Gospel of Thomas, it's also got some stuff in it that's just kind of Gnostic and kind of thrown out. All right. All right, next one. So we have 66 testimonies of 40 witnesses. And I'm going to read this to you because I know it's kind of small on the screen. But just imagine this, okay? If a fragment of stone were found in Italy, another in Asia Minor, another in Greece, another in Egypt, and on until 66 fragments had been found. And if when you put them all together, they fit perfectly together, making a perfect statue of the Venus statue. There is not an artist or scientist, but would arrive immediately at the conclusion that there was originally a sculptor who conceived and carved the statue. The very lines and perfections would probably determine which of the great ancient artists carved the statue. Not only the unity of the scriptures, but their lines of perfection suggest one far above any human as the real author, and that could only be God. And if you think about all of the ages that this would have had to be put together, and the different places that they were done, and yet they all sync up, and they all point to real historical things that took place. And as archaeology finds new things, they're like, oh, see, it did say that pool was there, and now we found it. You know, that kind of thing. And if you look at other writings in other religions, you don't find any of that. You'll find maybe like I think the Quran, for example, was written like 200 years after Muhammad, so way past the eyewitness time. There were holes in it that had to be changed. I don't know if any of you ever read the Book of Mormon, right? But it had to be changed because there were historical problems with it. And later when they said, oh, they didn't even have horses on the North American continent then, right? And because they were brought over by Europeans or whatever, and they're like, oh, we better change that. So delete the horses. And, so it's, things like that we haven't had to have that happen to our scriptures. And so we can feel pretty good about believing that we have the real, no kidding, Word of God. All right, next thing. All right, so we're now going to look at some of the evidence for the Bible. All right, last week we kind of went over some things in Genesis, and I pulled out this one here for the biblical flood, because the flood is probably one of those events in the Bible that's attracted the most scorn, I guess, and regarding the reliability of the Bible. And the reasoning used is similar to the reasoning used in the creation story. It's the story of the flood. If it's not reliable, then the rest of the Bible is probably not reliable either. That's kind of the foundation that we have. And so some of the things that we found are marine fossils found at the highest mountain ranges in the world. It tells us that at one time, these oceans covered the continents. Now, some scientists believe, the continents sank and then they came back up. Some believe the Genesis flag was responsible, or Genesis flood was responsible. I went to the Ark exhibit in Kentucky, and one of the exhibits that fascinated me was, because I had always heard about, there were so many flood stories out there. You got the Gilgamesh story in Babylon, and you got all these different cultures, which kind of told me that it probably happened, because why would this same story be all over the place, right? But one of the neatest things that I saw in this exhibit was the different other flood stories, other than Noah's story, describes the kind of boat that these other cultures had. Like one was the circular boat, okay? And scientifically, they analyzed what each of these boats were capable of doing. And there's a reason why our modern day cargo ships look like the Ark looked, right? Rectangular. And it's because it's able to withstand the waves of the ocean, right? Like the circular one, it showed what it would happen to it and it would break up. And so all these other ones, other stories of the flood and their structures scientifically have been proven to say, okay, it couldn't be that because it wouldn't have survived, right? So I thought that was pretty interesting that they showed that. This is another one. Go ahead to the next one there. This is called ancient kanji. I think I'm saying it right. It's Chinese. It's their earliest, the roots of their civilization. And they found that the Chinese and the Jews have a lot of common roots. Okay. For example, they read from left to right. Okay. Um, and one of the neat things about their script is how they say certain things, right? For example, and I know it's kind of hard to see, but on the top right, you see the character for a ship, okay? And in order to make a ship, you have to be able to put other characters in there to make the ship, right? And in this case, they show that the word for boat is in there, okay? So the first part of that part up there, and oh, it cut it off on your screen. I'm sorry about that. I didn't realize you couldn't see that. But you see that first part that looks almost like an A, the first left side of it. Okay, that's their character for a boat. Okay, so that's first off, it's a boat. Then the next one is those two slashes in the upper right. Okay, well that's their word for 8. Okay, so there's a boat with 8 on it, right? And then the next one is a mouth, and that represents people, right? So basically, their character for a ship, so any ship, right, is a boat full of 8 people, right? And so you look at the ark that had 8 people, right? And you see this, and you find it throughout all of Chinese letters. You find, like, for example, it shows up there, what is a sacrificial animal, okay? The words ox, sheep, beautiful, which is unblemished, okay? The word for unblemished, and spear are all put together to make sacrificial animal, okay? And so why would those animals be chosen to be the sacrificial animal, right? And you'll find when you talk about the Garden of Eden, right? And you look at those words and you find 2 trees, right? And you find the mouth and you find the word God, right? And so you put all these together for their word for garden, right? And so you're thinking, how did they come up with 2 trees, a mouth, right? And all this for the word for garden, right? It's like they have the Garden of Eden right there in front of them, but yet they will not look at this as evidence that they have anything of in their ancient past to do with creation or anything else, because they see it as, oh, that's a Western thing and we don't want anything to do with that, right? But I just thought that was really interesting. Okay. Another thing that we have is the rules of hygiene, right? I mean, only in modern science have we figured out that the rules that are written in the Bible to do with hygiene, and there's reasons why you don't eat certain animals, and there's reasons why you wash before you eat or do these things, is because it makes you live a lot longer, right? Because you're eating right and you're not getting these bacterias, right? That the ancient man would have never known those things, right? But they're built in there, right? Um, you know, there's one is the one that says don't boil meat in the mother's milk, right? Well, that's like a cheeseburger, right? So that tells you right there, cheeseburgers are probably not healthy for you, right? Right. So anyway, all right. So we go to the end of this, and we look at, okay, is there any other evidence that we can see in like the last, let's say the last 50 years, right? And with the advent of the internet, we've had the advantage of being able to see some things that we maybe wouldn't have been able to see, that people that were over in Saudi Arabia were able to maybe take pictures of and stuff. And so I have a couple on here, but the first one I was going to show you here. Okay, so you're looking at the Sinai Peninsula. Okay, so you got Egypt on the left, and you got the Red Sea that's on the left there, and then you've got another gulf. I forget the name of it. I can't even read that. but it's like the Gulf of, is it like Aqua or something, right? And if you were to look at Sinai now, you would find a place that's called Mount Sinai, right? And a lot of people now are like, okay, even though it says that on the map, Mount Sinai, right, which is at the southern part of Mount Sinai or the Sinai Peninsula, a lot of people believe that that's not really where it took place, where Mount Sinai took place. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of evidence because the Israelites came from the upper part where Goshen was. They come down, right, from the upper part. So they're not even crossing the Red Sea area. They'd be crossing across that Aqua place right in about the middle. And if you were able to drain all the water out, you find that there's an area in there that actually isn't as deep as the rest, okay? And go ahead to the next picture. One of the things that these have been torn down now, but these remained until very recently, right? And they were called the pillars that Solomon marked the crossings. There was one on one side of the Sinai Peninsula and one on the Saudi Arabia side. And so, until Christians started investigating and saying, hey, we have some evidence here that Solomon marked the spots that they wanted to mark where the crossing of the Red Sea was at. And then they took them down. So there's only these pictures that we have remaining of those. All right, show the next one. If you continue and you look and you do a deep sea in that same area, you find chariot wheels. See a lot of evidence of that crossing, and so we still have stuff like that today. But it's kind of like Mount Ararat. It's controlled by people in the world that don't want any kind of proof of us to find anything, so they keep us from looking anytime to really find the stuff. All right, go ahead to the next one there. This is again in Saudi Arabia, so this is on the other side of that crossing, and it's in a place where they believe the real Mount Sinai was, because there's a lot of evidence in that area. And this is one of the rocks that they believe might have been where the golden calf had been created, and they still have all these writings that were actually writings that Egyptians or the Jews from Egypt would have written, and symbolized that this took place right here. So, that could have been the very rock that they put the golden calf on at the foot of what was really Mount Sinai. Go ahead and show the next one there. This is nearby too, and it's a rock that if you, I don't know if there's a man standing in the middle there, but a man would be just a small little smidget inside that crack right there. And there's evidence of water flowing out of that crack right there. And to make the erosion of the rocks in that area, they said it would have taken millions of gallons of water to do that. And so and this was near there. And so a lot of people believe this was the rock that Moses struck to get water, and so stuff like that. And it's still in Saudi Arabia right now. But of course, how can you get over there to look at any of this stuff? But anyway, it's kind of neat that we live in a time when a lot of this stuff is, if you really look for it, you can find some evidence maybe of it. And I think that's the last one, right, Russ? Yeah. Okay. Any questions about anything? So tonight was about the scriptures, about the Bible. And one of the things that we looked at was the manuscript evidence of it, the timing of it for being in the eyewitness period of time, and then the archaeological evidence of the scriptures that we can see today. Is there any questions that you've ever had about the origins or the Bible scriptures that you want to add to any of that? Anything? Gretchen? Nothing? What? All right. Well, that's all I have tonight. Next week is the final week that we answer the question about Jesus himself. I think it's going to be a lot more interesting. But, if we can answer those three questions in our mind to someone who says, okay, what's your evidence of why you believe what you believe? That's the whole thing of apologetics, is saying, okay, I have an answer, and That's what I believe, and it's backed by not just faith and saying, hey, I believe because I believe. You actually have some things that you could say, no, really, we have evidence of this, that we're not just blindly believing something because somebody else told us that. Okay? All right. If nothing else, then do we have any prayer requests? I have one. Gretchen's going to have an MRI done tomorrow, and she's really nervous about